Hi everyone. I am Jacob Lillioja. I'm an engineer with Premise Data. At Premise, we're distributed to 156 countries and 40 different languages. And actually, a lot of our users get their income from our app. So it's really important that we have good translations for any feature we have that has user-facing strength. And you might imagine from 40 different languages, getting those translations is a pretty non-trivial engineering effort. We actually iterated on a process to make this work that I'm going to describe to you. And the initial approach that I'm going to describe is slow and difficult, but it also works. And that's something that's not to be taken lightly with a system that's this complex. The title of the talk is Automating Localization, but in hindsight, it might have been better titled something like Optimizing Localization, because while automation is a big part of the solution we have, the systemic and procedural changes that we make are possibly even bigger. So I'm going to take you through the journey that we took from the process, the working process that we had when I began working, to the process we have now, and even to the process we are now working towards. So let's start with our naive approach. It begins with development, of course. We would develop our features that have interface strings. We would try our best to, at the beginning of developing a feature, collect all the strings that we would need to end up getting translated. But inevitably, there would be design changes, scope changes, and we would have just a couple more strings that we need to get translated right at the end of that feature being developed. And because we want our master branch to always be releasable, we would not let people merge their feature branches to master unless it had all the strings that it was needed, that it needed to go out. Which meant that feature branches could not be merged translations, which was a big frustration for people on our team. When people would get the strings that they needed, they would submit requests for those translations to the translation manager, which for most of the past year would be. I would collect those all every 2 weeks in a Jira ticket, and then at the end of each sprint, I would make a batch submission to order all the strings that we needed once per sprint. And then we would have to wait for up to 10 days, sometimes more, depending on if the translators needed clarification about what something meant, as well as 5 days, as many as 10, during which we would not be able to merge translations, we would not be able to proceed with the feature being released, sometimes we wouldn't be able to proceed with the release at all. But after the 10 days had passed, I would then be able to download them, those translations, check them for approximate correctness, and that they can compile, PR them into our master branch, and after all of that, now those feature branches could get merged in. We could begin our QA testing process for release, after which we could begin the Google Play Store review process. So this is a very sequential process. Each of these steps depend on the last, and waiting, and then these release processes could take weeks. And then even after the feature was fully developed, it could be up to a month sometimes before we could even release it. This did work. This did keep this system coordinated, but it was much more time consuming and caused huge delays that were not necessary. So let's review those problems. They fall broadly into one of these 2 categories: the manual efforts it took for me and the other engineers to report this process, but also the blocking of progress of being able to release features or release releases. These are some of the manual steps that mostly I had to do, but really all of the engineers on our team would have to coordinate the translation requests that they needed to make. They needed to make sure when they were starting to do a feature that they would collect all the strings they need and put them in the right place so that I could, at the end of the sprint, submit them all, which I would have to go and submit and then monitor that order, make sure it was on track so we could get back in time for the next release. And then I would need to download them, I would check them, and then I would need to create the PR to go in and get that approved, and just a lot of these manual steps to get through this. But perhaps even more destructive to our productivity were the blocking progress that this process entailed, in which we couldn't proceed with releases, the features were postponed, and the work in progress could not be merged, which meant people would be rebasing. Every time it's a month, so I've got this big feature branch that I've been working on for months, and I've got to do a rebase every time there's some new update because I can't get it into master without these transitions. So these were some of the problems that motivated us to rethink our strategy. So let's take a look at what strategy we came up with. And before we talk about that, I have to tell you a little bit about localization platforms. Because if you were trying to go about a strategy like this, you would end up either using or building yourself one of these platforms. We use localized, but there's a lot of options. There's localized, translate, spray, Scrum, and others even. But what's important is that, at least for us, they supported these features, as you said. One is an API by which we can perform most operations, which you can, as you would expect, is crucial for us to automate anything to have run as part of the script. A really key part of our strategy was over-the-air translation delivery, OTA. So that means that when translations are made, it can be delivered to the app even without having to include it in the APK. And finally, they support both human and machine translation. So while we do want to have the quality of human translations, we also appreciated the speed of a rough first pass machine translation. So let's take a look at how we coordinated these features into a new strategy. As before, we start with developing the features, but now we allow developers to merge them to master without issue. And then we proceed directly to release. No monkey about in the middle, because everything happens after the release is cut. So we'll zoom in on our release box here and see what happens. As part of our CI pipeline for cutting release, the strings XML is up the entire thing. So that includes all of the English strings that were added as part of feature development over the course of the sprint. The new or modified keys are identified and submitted for machine translation, which usually costs on the order of a few dollars and takes about 2.5 minutes. Much cheaper and quicker than human translations. And now we can parallelize the rest of this process. First, an OTA bundle, an over-the-air bundle, is generated with the machine translations, which means that those machine translations are available in our release candidate that has been created. And that means that the rest of the release processes can proceed with those machine translations, including release QA, who are usually not checking for accuracy of translations, but more things like, does this text overflow this box, or something like that, which is perfectly fine to do with machine translation. And we even submit to the Play Store, which can be a couple days, or it could be over a week, depending on what the season is. All of which time, the human translation can be in progress. And as I said, that can still take 5 to 10 days, but at least it can be occurring in parallel with all of these other time-consuming processes, such that by the time we get to the staged rollout, the first few percentage points of availability of the new release, that human order is completed, and a new over-the-air bundle is generated with those new improved translations. By the time almost all of our users are actually seeing the app, they have the same quality human translations that they would have had if we'd done this in the old-fashioned sequential way. So this is like half the time it takes for us to get to this stage rollout, and made so much difference to developers who no longer have to wait to get their features merged. They can now go ahead and merge, and then we can do all of this difficult process in parallel. So there's a huge improvement over our previous system. We can merge freely now. We're not blocking our releases. It's much less time-consuming for me. And one extra side benefit is that sometimes our users, or even other employees of our company, will tell us, hey, this translation, this new translation in this feature is not as good as it could be. It really should say something like this. And because we're delivering our translations over the air, I can just go into our translation management system, update that translation, generate a new bundle, and that new translation will be immediately available to anyone using the app, instead of having to be PR'd in and wait till the next release, and then only those people on that new release receiving that translation improvement. So that's a nice little side benefit we've got. But there is still some room for improvement, some downsides with this. The first is that over-the-air was somewhat technically challenging to implement. It took a little bit of time to figure out. It requires that the language ISO codes that our localization platform and our app used were the same, which they weren't and aren't necessarily in all cases. So we just needed to coordinate that a little bit. But more like procedural issues, sometimes because we are now allowing developers to merge work in progress to master, there would be draft screens of early iterations of design that we don't want to have translated. But in our current system, they would all automatically be uploaded and be paid for those translations even if we didn't want them. And because it's so much easier to make these changes, sometimes we just get these really tiny changes to like a preposition in an English string or something. We don't necessarily want to place an entire human translation order for it, because human translation orders, at least in our system, have a minimum cost of about $400. So sometimes we want to do just a really little change, and we don't want to pay $400 to do it in every single language. And finally, we still don't have a way of coordinating with the iOS team, who is often developing features in parallel with us, needing a lot of the same strings, and it would be really great if we could somehow coordinate our orders with those guys so that we're not paying twice. So given all of these, this room for improvements, we have a solution that we are now working towards. We have some of the way there, some of the way not, but I want to show you what our idea is. So again, let's zoom into the develop ops. Now, whenever a commit is made to the master branch on either Android or iOS, a PR is merged, we can immediately upload the strings XML file, and it'll be immediately available in our localization platform. The same is true for iOS. Their localizable .strings file can be uploaded. And that way, the localization platform can be a running record of all of the strings that are currently available in master. As another side note, we separated out our resource files into our strings XML, which now represents all of the strings we want to have translated, and other string resource files represent other strings we don't want to have translated. For instance, draft strings that we put work in progress strings into, and untranslatable strings that we use to do things like URLs or deep link codes that we don't want to have translated. And only that strings XML file that we do want to have entirely translated is up. And then after any changes to the set of keys in our localization platform, we can place an order for machine translations to be available immediately, because machine translations do not have a minimum order cost like human translations do, which means that no matter how tiny a change, we can go ahead and put in a machine translation order. It'll be ready in a minute and a half or less and cost a few cents. And so that way we at all times have some translations at least for any of the keys in our system. Moving on to the release process, much of this is the same as before, except now human translations are not ordered automatically. They are ordered only if necessary, only if we choose or decide that this release necessitates them, which we would if we had a big feature that was going in that we definitely wanted to have human translations for, or would be the case if we had accumulated a critical mass of screens that we want to translate for both Android and iOS. So in this way, we can batch together our translations and not have to pay that minimum fee for each of us, and can cut down our costs and get a little bit of money back in that way. But the rest of this process is the same as before. The OTA bundle is generated with machine translations. It's available for QA. It's available for Play Store review. It's available for the first few percentages of the stage rollout. And the human translation, if it was necessary, would be completed again by the time the stage rollout is beginning. Another OTA bundle would be generated, and those translations can be available. So this let us get a few extra pros over our old system. Now the draft strings are not being translated. They're often a separate file. Human translations can be at our discretion only when we feel that it's necessary. And we're able to batch our Android and iOS orders to save a little bit of money on that minimum order cost. So this is the process that we've come to from iterating kind of a number of times on this, but it is sort of tailored to our user base and our team's needs. So if you all, the audience, are looking to improve your localization process as well, you will probably have to start at a different place and possibly with different questions. I think you should think first about what your biggest costs are. For us, our biggest costs might have been the minimum order cost, but they might also have been the cost of developer time to have to rebase a feature every time. So think about what your biggest costs are and how the tools that I've described could help you to alleviate this cost. And in addition to those costs, in money, you can just think about what your biggest pain points are, where things get manual or where things get error prone, and how these tools could be used to build yourself safeguards and smooth out some of that process for your team and how you are working. And finally, you have to think about what your users need. If you're not localized as widely as we are, maybe a different solution is right for you. If your users don't expect to have translations ready for every release, maybe you need a different set of process than we do. So it's just important to think about what your actual users need before you start on implementing a big system like this. But I hope that some of the tools and the processes that I've described here could be useful to you in answering these questions for yourself. Thanks. That's all I've got for you. I think we've got a little bit of time for questions, but not too much because I know we're going to lunch. So, yep.
I can manage your UI testing. I will make sure that everything that comes back in every way fits on every possible place.
That's a good question for our QA team. I think that we're trying to get some automated testing in place. The OTA bundle is available to the app as soon as it's created. So I think that if our our espresso testing were to check for text overflow, it would be able to do that with machine translations. Other than that, we do manual testing. If there's a new feature and we know that some languages are more verbose or longer strings than others, we will check those in particular to see if it's okay. It's rare that a machine translation and human translation would be substantially different in length. They're usually about the same, even if they are slightly different in the actual characters they have.
Just to add, safety judgment. Another bit that we had is a very active group of sort of internal, we'll say alpha testers, specifically in our networks all around the world. So they do a lot of that kind of a manual way, which isn't maybe the most scalable, but actually works quite well for us at a lower cost than really building out all of the UI testing that we probably will start building here soon.
And to that point, that's why the continuous translation improvement is such a win for us, because we can get those pieces of feedback back and change the translation if necessary, and to be immediately available to the cut we want to see. Other?
I think my question is about an accurate question. I did find out recently about this message.
So now we are pretty consistently able to cut our release on schedule. Previously, we could easily spend another week waiting for these translations to come back. I did say 10 days for the wait. That was kind of the worst case scenario. It was between 5 to 10 days. And it also depended on how many more streams were necessary. Sometimes we would successfully guess all of the streams we were going to need for the feature, and then we wouldn't have this problem. But it did happen often enough that it was a significant pain point that caused about a week of additional time before we used to go out.
Or you try to push this localization in the back end from the API. So what do you think about those two approaches? Right? One is we still using localized string in the client side versus using the API to give us those.
So currently we are using the OTA to deliver the translations, but we are also going and trying to get another automated process, which we are still setting up to get those strings automated. We are back into our app, so that if for whatever reason the OTA request fails or the users have a network connection or something, they can still have all the translations that have been made up to that point. The translations themselves are a pretty small request that we only do on app launch, so one time for a dozen kilobits maybe. So we thought that was an okay cost to be able to have this quality improvement to the translations. Those are the good things about we decided to develop this.
You spoke about graph strings that you don't want translated. In the similar way, what about substrings that you don't want translated? How do you approach those? Consider, for example, designed by Apple in California. You don't want Apple to be translated as
Yeah, that's
a random. So how do you manage that?
great question. There's a lot of nuance that I actually cut out of this talk, so I can make sure I get it in before lunch. The localization platform that we use has a really great way of knowing those screens. We put in a set of please don't translate these screens. Our company name is one of them. We don't want it to translate premise, which is a regular English word as well. We can mark those screens, and then they will be annotated in the localization platform, so that when they're submitted to translators, the translators know don't translate this screen, don't translate premise, don't translate Apple, don't translate Google, or something like that.
So are these strings also animated in your scripts or XML? Or
Not in our strings XML, they are like in the regular, like English strings, they're not marked anyway. We did that in the platform.
All the translations that you're doing, machine translated, where is that stuck in the pipeline, or are you using for that Google Translate?
Yeah, we're using Google Translate. Our localization platform offers a way to do that through their API, and then they will handle a lot of these things, like making sure things are not translated when they're not supposed to be. They provide it as an order process in the same way that they support human translation orders. So we have two steps. We have the submit order for machine translation, which uses the same API just with a different translation provider, and then we later do a human order, which just uses a different translation provider that has human translators.
Last one is about accessibility. Right now, we have quite many issues related to the accessibility. So, related to these translations, you have any suggestion?
What kind of accessibility?
That is a call out for the disabled people.
Oh, that's a great question. I think we've looked at improving that system for ourselves as well. I don't think we have implementation of it yet. That's a great piece of it because there is like a text-to-speech sort of thing for accessibility that we have not yet figured out. I would imagine you could do this same system for it if those are available streaming resources. You could have them translated into other languages as well, and have them be provided by the same system. But unfortunately, I haven't read that. That's a great question. If there are no more questions, then call it there and head to lunch. Thanks all for your time.